In the spring of 2021, a trail camera mounted to a fence post along a creek drainage in Ringgold County, Iowa, captured something that took the landowner several days to process. The image was clear. The timestamp was reliable. The animal in the frame was large, tawny, long-tailed, and moving with the particular fluid deliberateness of a cat that has no reason to hurry. It was, by every visual characteristic that wildlife biologists use to distinguish the species from domestic animals, a mountain lion. A full-grown one, by the look of it, moving through a landscape that, according to every official characterization of mountain lion range in the upper Midwest, it had no business being in. The landowner sent the image to the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. The DNR confirmed what the image showed. They assigned it to the growing file of documented mountain lion occurrences in a state where the species has not maintained a confirmed resident breeding population since at least the 1880s, and possibly longer. They issued no press release. The confirmation went into a database and stayed there, which is more or less what happens to most of the Iowa mountain lion records, quietly verified, carefully categorized, and then allowed to exist in a kind of institutional silence that reflects something important about the uncomfortable position these records create for wildlife managers who are not quite sure how to talk about what they are seeing. Because what they are seeing, taken together, is this. Mountain lions are appearing in Iowa with an increasing regularity that can no longer be described as a string of extraordinary one-off events. The detections are spread across the state. They are occurring in habitat types that mountain lion range maps have historically excluded from serious consideration. They are being confirmed by a state wildlife agency that has maintained one of the most rigorous and conservative verification protocols for mountain lion records of any state in the upper Midwest, meaning these are not misidentified bobcats, not grainy game camera smears that could be anything, not stories passed between hunters around a fire. These are verified, and they are adding up to something that the standard framework for understanding mountain lion presence in Iowa, the framework built on the assumption that any lion showing up east of the Missouri River is a rare dispersing individual passing through without ecological consequence, is no longer fully adequate to explain. Before getting into what the Iowa records actually show and what they mean, take a moment to understand something about the mountain lion's relationship to the American landscape more broadly, because without that context, the Iowa situation looks like a curiosity when it is actually a chapter in a much larger and more consequential story. If you find this kind of deep, careful examination of wildlife stories worth your time, subscribe now, because this is exactly the kind of work that happens here regularly, and you will want to be here for the rest of it. The mountain lion, Puma concolor, is the most widely distributed wildland mammal in the Western Hemisphere. Its historical range stretched from the Yukon in Canada, south through Central and South America, to Patagonia. In North America, before European colonization, it occupied every ecosystem type that held sufficient prey: the deciduous forests of the east, the boreal zones of the north, the desert basins of the southwest, the tallgrass prairie of the Great Plains, the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. It was, in the ecological sense, everywhere, not at high densities in all of those places. Mountain lions are solitary, territorial, low-density apex predators that require large home ranges and abundant prey. But they were present across a continent of extraordinary ecological variety, which tells you something fundamental about the animal's adaptability. It is not a habitat specialist in the way that, say, a wolverine or a Canada lynx is a habitat specialist. It is a generalist predator that tracks prey rather than vegetation type or elevation or watershed. Where deer go, mountain lions can go, and deer, in North America, go nearly everywhere. The systematic elimination of mountain lions from the eastern two-thirds of the continent is one of the larger ecological transformations of the post-colonial era in North America, and it happened so thoroughly and over a period long enough that living memory cannot hold it, that most people in states like Iowa simply do not include mountain lions in their mental model of what belongs in the landscape around them. Wolves are remembered, sometimes with controversy. Bears are remembered in certain places. But mountain lions disappeared from the upper Midwest and the East so early, and the disappearance was so complete, that what replaced them in the public imagination was a landscape defined by their absence. Iowa is a state of row crops and river bottoms. It is a state of white-tailed deer, so abundant they are a management problem. It is not, in the popular imagination, a state of apex predators. There is no cultural memory of mountain lions in Iowa because no living Iowan, and no living Iowan's grandparents, grew up in a landscape where mountain lions were part of the regular ecological furniture. The category was simply empty. The mechanism that emptied it was straightforward and brutal. Bounty systems that paid cash for mountain lion carcasses were in place across most of the species range, east of the Rockies, from the colonial period through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Combined with habitat loss, prey depletion, and the general policy orientation toward predator elimination that characterized American land management for the first century and a half of the Republic's existence, these programs were extraordinarily effective. Mountain lions were functionally extirpated from the Great Plains, the Midwest, and the entire eastern seaboard by the early 20th century, with the exception of a small and genetically isolated population in southern Florida that became what we now call the Florida panther. The last confirmed mountain lion killed in Iowa by a hunter or trapper under the bounty system was recorded in 1867, though occasional unconfirmed reports persisted for decades after that. By the turn of the 20th century, Iowa had been without mountain lions for long enough that their return, when it eventually began, would require an entirely new framework for understanding what was happening and why. That return began not in Iowa, but in the northern Rockies and the Black Hills of South Dakota, and it began for reasons that are well understood in the ecological literature. The elimination of bounty systems across most western states and provinces in the 1960s and 1970s, combined with the transition to regulated sport hunting and in some cases to full protection, allowed mountain lion populations that had been suppressed for decades to recover. The recovery was not uniform. It was fastest in areas with the most robust prey populations and the least human development. But it was substantial. By the 1980s, mountain lion populations across the Rocky Mountain West were growing in range and density. By the 1990s, the leading edge of that expansion was reaching the margins of states that had not supported resident mountain lion populations in living memory. Wyoming, Nebraska, the Dakotas. Young male mountain lions, pushed out of established territories by resident animals, dispersing across the landscape in search of unoccupied territory, were appearing in places that previous generations of wildlife managers would have considered implausible. The dispersal biology of mountain lions is essential to understanding why Iowa is seeing what it is seeing, and it is worth spending real time on, because it is more dramatic and more geographically extensive than most people appreciate. When a young male mountain lion is evicted from the range where it was raised, typically at somewhere between 1 and 2 years of age, it enters a dispersal phase that can cover extraordinary distances. The documented dispersal movements of radio-collared young males in the western United States include movements of 300, 400, even 500 miles in straight-line distance. These animals are not following corridors in the conventional sense. They are moving through whatever landscape they encounter, crossing highways, navigating agricultural terrain, crossing rivers. They are following deer, and deer in the upper Midwest are everywhere. A young male mountain lion that begins its dispersal in the Black Hills of South Dakota which supports the largest and most reproductively active mountain lion population in the Great Plains region, can be in Iowa within a matter of weeks if it is moving with purpose through favorable terrain. The Missouri River, which might seem like a barrier, is not an effective one for a large cat. Lions swim. They cross rivers as a routine matter. The geographic distance between the Black Hills and the Iowa border is not, in mountain lion biology, a deterrent. It is a dispersal route. The Iowa Department of Natural Resources began formally tracking mountain lion occurrences in the state in the mid-2000s, when the rate of reports had increased enough that informal case-by-case handling was no longer adequate. The verification protocol they established is worth describing because it explains why the confirmed records have the evidential weight they do. Iowa DNR wildlife biologists verify mountain lion occurrences against a set of criteria that require physical evidence or photographic documentation of sufficient quality to allow species identification by a qualified biologist. Tracks alone, unless they are of exceptional clarity and appropriate size, are generally not confirmed. Eyewitness reports, without corroborating physical evidence, are recorded but not confirmed. Confirmed records require either a high-quality photograph or video showing a full animal with identifiable morphological characteristics, a physical specimen such as a road-killed or harvested animal, or a track or scat sample that has been examined and measured by a biologist and meets species-specific criteria. This is a conservative standard. It means the confirmed record is almost certainly an undercount of actual mountain lion presence in the state, possibly by a substantial margin. What gets confirmed is the floor, not the ceiling. Against that conservative standard, Iowa had, as of the most recent publicly available summary, confirmed more than 24 mountain lion occurrences in the state since the mid-2000s, spread across nearly every region of Iowa. The distribution of these records is one of the most informative aspects of the dataset. Early records were concentrated in the western and northwestern portions of the state, closest to the Black Hills source population and to the Missouri River corridor. This made sense within the dispersal framework. Young males moving east from South Dakota would naturally appear first in the portions of Iowa closest to their origin. What the dataset shows over time, and this is the part that complicates the simple dispersal narrative, is a progressive eastward spread of confirmed detections. Records from the central part of the state, records from the eastern river corridors, particularly along the Iowa and Cedar rivers. A confirmed occurrence in the early 2010s from a county in eastern Iowa, so far from any established western population that calculating the straight-line dispersal distance made experienced wildlife biologists pause to consider what it implied about how extensively these animals were moving through the state, and whether the movements were as episodic as the official framework assumed. The episodic dispersal framework, sometimes called the lone male hypothesis in informal wildlife management discussion, is the interpretation that has dominated official characterizations of mountain lion presence in Iowa and other upper Midwest states for the past 2 decades. It holds that the lions appearing in these states are individual, dispersing young males, almost always males, moving through territory they will never settle and never breed in, representing no permanent ecological footprint, posing no management challenges beyond the individual encounters they occasionally produce, and contributing nothing to the establishment of a resident population. The framework has several things going for it. The documented detections in Iowa have been predominantly male. The genetic analysis of confirmed specimens, where specimens have been available, has linked them to western source populations consistent with dispersal. The movements documented by trail cameras and verified by biologists are consistent with animals passing through rather than establishing home ranges. The framework is not fabricated. It describes something real about most of the mountain lion records coming out of Iowa and similar states. The question that is beginning to be asked more directly in the wildlife biology literature, and somewhat more quietly in the management community, is whether the episodic dispersal framework is sufficient to describe what is happening now in 2024 as opposed to what was happening in 2005. The frequency of confirmed detections in Iowa has increased, not dramatically, but measurably. The geographic distribution of those detections has expanded, and in at least 2 cases in the historical record, confirmed records have emerged from areas of the state that suggest an animal had been present long enough to establish something resembling a home range rather than a through dispersal movement. Though neither of these cases produced evidence of reproduction, and both animals apparently moved on or died without leaving detected offspring. The lone male hypothesis may be correct in most individual cases, and still be inadequate as a complete characterization of what is happening in the aggregate. This is the point at which the Iowa situation connects to something much larger that is happening across the entire Great Plains and Upper Midwest, and understanding that larger pattern is important for understanding what Iowa is actually facing and what it might face in the future. The Black Hills population of mountain lions in South Dakota is the engine driving most of the confirmed detections in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and the other states, in the dispersal shadow of that range. That population has been growing. It has been documented expanding its range into the Pine Ridge in Nebraska. There are confirmed breeding records from Nebraska, from Kansas, and from Missouri, states that, like Iowa, spent most of the 20th century in the officially empty category. The breeding records in those states represent something qualitatively different from passing dispersers. They represent animals that found sufficient habitat, sufficient prey, and sufficient isolation from human disturbance to successfully reproduce. They represent the first steps of genuine recolonization, a process that, once begun in adjacent states, changes the probability calculations for Iowa in ways that the simple dispersal framework does not capture. Missouri is the most instructive case because it is geographically proximate to Iowa, because its documented mountain lion history parallels Iowa's in many respects, and because the trajectory of its detections over the past 20 years offers a possible preview of where Iowa is heading. Missouri began formally tracking mountain lion occurrences at roughly the same time Iowa did, and with a similar verification standard. Its early confirmed records were predominantly males, concentrated in the western part of the state, consistent with dispersal from the Black Hills. Over time, its detection frequency increased. Detections spread east. At some point in the 2010s, biologists began to see records that were not easily explained by direct dispersal from the Black Hills. The genetic diversity in the Missouri specimens was broader than would be expected from a single-source population. The implication, not definitively established but suggested by the data, was that some of the Missouri lions were second-generation animals, offspring of earlier dispersers, meaning that reproduction had occurred somewhere in the dispersal shadow of the Black Hills, in sufficient numbers to be producing animals that were now themselves dispersing, without anyone having pinpointed the breeding location. The population was not visible, but it appeared to be producing. The ecological corridor question is central to everything that follows from this, and it is one of the most actively examined topics in mountain lion conservation biology in the Great Plains region. The question is this: the Black Hills represent an established population. The Ozark Highlands in Missouri represent potential habitat. The river corridors of Iowa, the Missouri River bottomland, the Des Moines and Cedar River systems represent potential travel routes and potentially usable habitat. Is there a functional landscape corridor connecting the Black Hills to the Ozarks through Iowa and Missouri? If there is, then the movement of lions through Iowa is not simply a series of disconnected individual dispersals. It is traffic on a route. Traffic on a route implies that the route has some degree of permanence and ecological function. that it moves animals in both directions over time, and that the probability of successful recolonization somewhere along or near that route is higher than it would be if every occurrence were truly random. The research that has been done on this question, primarily through habitat modeling, GPS tracking of known individuals, and analysis of confirmed occurrence databases, suggests that the answer is conditional. The corridor exists in habitat terms. There is sufficient deer prey, sufficient cover, and sufficient spatial continuity of viable land cover between the Black Hills and the Ozarks to allow a mountain lion to move through the landscape. The question is whether that habitat continuity is matched by social and reproductive continuity, meaning whether animals moving through the corridor are encountering each other at sufficient rates to allow mating to occur, and whether females, who disperse shorter distances than males and who are the rate-limiting step in population establishment, are successfully moving through the corridor as well. The documented occurrence record in Iowa contains very few confirmed female records. This is consistent with the lone male hypothesis, but also consistent with females being present at lower densities and detection rates without being absent. The absence of detected females is not the same as the absence of females, particularly under a verification standard that, by design, requires physical evidence and may systematically undercount animals that are more secretive and less inclined to move through areas where trail cameras are concentrated. The deer population dynamic in Iowa is a factor in this picture that does not receive enough attention in discussions of mountain lion presence. Iowa has one of the highest white-tailed deer densities in North America. This is the product of decades of intensive deer management, agricultural landscape structure that provides exceptional deer habitat, and the absence of native apex predators that would otherwise regulate deer populations. Iowa deer management is a significant industry and a significant cultural institution in the state. Hundreds of thousands of deer are harvested by hunters every year, and the population remains extraordinarily high. From the perspective of a dispersing mountain lion, Iowa is an essentially unlimited prey base. The food resource that would support a resident mountain lion population is not a constraint. Unlike in some parts of the West, where prey availability limits mountain lion density and distribution, Iowa's deer herd represents a prey base that could theoretically support a substantial mountain lion population. The habitat is not ideal in the conventional sense. Iowa lacks the rugged topography and the extensive roadless areas that mountain lion territory mapping has historically favored. But mountain lions in the Great Plains region have demonstrated repeatedly and with documented evidence that they can maintain territories and successfully reproduce in river corridor habitats with relatively gentle topography if prey is abundant. The Missouri and Iowa River bottomlands offer that combination. The timber stands along those drainages, combined with the agricultural matrix that supports deer at extraordinary densities, represent a habitat configuration that is not wilderness, but is not inhospitable either. The human landscape in Iowa adds dimensions to this picture that are both more and less complicating than the situation in western states. Iowa does not have the extensive wildland-urban interface of California or Colorado, where mountain lion habitat and suburban development interpenetrate across millions of acres. The landscape is primarily agricultural, with human population concentrated in cities and towns. The dispersal corridors that lions use in Iowa, the river bottomlands and creek drainages, are relatively lightly used by humans for recreation compared to the trail systems of the Rocky Mountain region. This means that the encounter dynamics that drive attack risk in California and Colorado, the trail runners, the suburban hikers, the children playing in peri-urban open space adjacent to mountain lion habitat, are not yet significantly present in Iowa. The state's mountain lion risk profile is currently much more modest than California's, not because the animals are less dangerous, but because the interface conditions that translate lion presence into human encounter risk are less developed. Currently is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because the trajectory of what is happening in Iowa matters as much as the current state. The outdoor recreation industry in Iowa has been growing. Trail systems along the river corridors, precisely the habitat that mountain lions prefer for movement and hunting, have been expanding. The state's conservation reserve and natural area land base has grown substantially over the past 2 decades, adding habitat connectivity in ways that benefit not just the deer and turkey that were the primary management targets, but any other species that uses similar terrain. If the mountain lion's presence in Iowa progresses from episodic dispersal to established resident population, the human landscape it will be coexisting with is not the Iowa of 1990. It is an Iowa with more trail users, more river corridor recreation, more rural residential development in bottomland habitat, and more cultural unfamiliarity with the appropriate behavioral protocols around a large predator that most Iowans have never thought about in their own backyard. The public education infrastructure for mountain lion coexistence that states like Colorado and California have built over decades of managing resident populations does not exist in Iowa, because there has been no resident population to manage. Building that infrastructure in response to an established population, rather than in anticipation of one, is the harder and more dangerous approach. The Iowa DNR's official position on mountain lion management has evolved over the years in ways that track the evidence, while maintaining a careful distance from conclusions that would require significant policy or public communication changes. The current official language acknowledges mountain lion presence in the state, describes detections as consistent with dispersal from western populations, notes that there is no evidence of an established breeding population in Iowa, and advises residents who encounter a mountain lion to report the sighting to the DNR. It does not include language about behavioral protocols for mountain lion encounters of the type that is standard in mountain lion range states. It does not include specific guidance for parents, outdoor recreationists, or livestock owners, beyond general livestock protection recommendations that were added after confirmed livestock depredations occurred in western Iowa. The gap between what the evidence suggests about trajectory and what the official communications advise about preparation is not unique to Iowa and is not the product of bad faith. It reflects a genuine tension in wildlife management communication about how to discuss the possible without alarming the public about something that has not yet reached the threshold of confirmed management concern. But it also reflects a calculus about public relations and political risk that occasionally produces less preparation than the evidence warrants. The livestock depredation records in western Iowa are worth examining specifically because they represent the most concrete economic and practical impact of mountain lion presence in the state, and because they are the category of incident most likely to drive political attention to the issue. Confirmed mountain lion depredations on livestock in Iowa have been documented in multiple counties in the western part of the state, concentrated in areas where lions appear to be spending enough time to become familiar with the local prey base. The livestock taken in confirmed Iowa depredations have included sheep, goats, calves, and at least one confirmed horse foal. The confirmation standard for livestock depredations involves physical examination of carcasses by wildlife biologists who look for the specific bite patterns, the prey handling behavior, and the feeding characteristics that distinguish mountain lion kills from coyote, dog, or other predator kills. The confirmed Iowa livestock depredations represent a category of mountain lion activity that is qualitatively different from a lone male passing through. They represent an animal that has been present long enough and consistently enough in an area to begin hunting in it with regular results. An animal that is hunting livestock successfully in a given area is, by definition, not simply transiting. It is establishing a provisional ecological relationship with the landscape. The response of Iowa farmers and rural residents to confirmed mountain lion presence has been varied and reflects the political complexity of introducing a large predator into a landscape whose residents did not vote for its presence and did not grow up with it. Some rural Iowans have expressed interest in the ecological story of mountain lion return and see it as a marker of landscape health. They are not the majority of the concerned calls that Iowa DNR officers receive after confirmed lion incidents. The majority response from the agricultural community has been skepticism about the episodic dispersal narrative. That is, a sense that wildlife managers are underplaying the regularity and potential permanence of mountain lion presence to avoid a management controversy, combined with concern about livestock security and, in some communities, about children. The concern about children is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing with statistics, because the parents expressing it are not being irrational. They are living in a landscape that they are being told contains, intermittently and unpredictably, an apex predator that their children have never been taught to behave around, and the official guidance they are receiving does not match the thoroughness of the guidance that parents in established mountain lion range states receive as standard. The question of what Iowa's mountain lion future looks like is genuinely open in a way that most wildlife management questions about established species are not, because the species in question is actively in the process of making the decision about whether to establish. The factors that will determine the outcome are partly biological and largely outside human control. They include whether dispersing females successfully make it through the dispersal corridor in sufficient numbers to locate unrelated males, whether those pairs establish home ranges in suitable habitat before being detected and removed, whether their offspring survive long enough and disperse far enough to establish second-generation territories, and whether the source populations in the Black Hills and potentially in Nebraska and Kansas continue to produce the dispersal pressure that pushes animals eastward. These are biological and demographic processes that operate largely below the threshold of human observation and management intervention. The probability that these processes will eventually produce a confirmed resident breeding population somewhere in Iowa is not calculable with precision, but the trajectory of the evidence does not suggest it is decreasing. The factors within human control are primarily about how Iowa manages the individual confirmed occurrences it is documenting, and this is where the policy choices being made now have the most direct consequence for the future. Iowa currently operates under a wildlife management framework that treats mountain lions as non-protected, non-resident transients. There is no open hunting season on mountain lions in Iowa, because there is no recognized resident population to manage under a hunting framework. But mountain lions encountered on private property causing depredation can be killed by landowners in most circumstances, and the removal of individual problem animals by DNR staff is the primary management response to confirmed incidents involving livestock or human safety concerns. This framework was designed for the occasional lone male passing through. It was not designed for the potential establishment of a resident population, and the policy gaps that would become evident if confirmed breeding were documented are substantial. The documented history of mountain lion recolonization in states and regions from which the species was extirpated provides some guidance about what Iowa might expect in terms of timeline and trajectory, though the comparisons are imperfect. The recovery of mountain lions in the Black Hills itself, from a functionally extirpated state in the early 20th century to the robust population that exists today, required several decades of protection and prey recovery, and did not occur in a linear way. The establishment of confirmed breeding mountain lions in Nebraska followed decades of documented dispersal records and occurred quietly and without announcement, the first confirmed breeding being identified retrospectively through genetic analysis, rather than through the kind of denning observation that would have allowed early detection. The Missouri case, with its suggestion of second-generation dispersers appearing in the record, represents a possible middle stage of recolonization, in which reproduction is occurring somewhere in the landscape but has not yet produced the kind of sustained documented presence that triggers formal population recognition by wildlife managers. Iowa, if it follows a similar trajectory, might be somewhere earlier in that sequence. Or it might be further along than the confirmed record suggests, with females moving through more quietly than males, and reproduction occurring in areas and at times that the current monitoring effort is not capturing. The monitoring infrastructure in Iowa for mountain lions is, by the standards of established range states, minimal. The Iowa DNR does not operate a systematic mountain lion monitoring program comparable to those in Colorado, California, or Washington. There is no ongoing GPS collar study of Iowa mountain lions. There is no systematic camera survey effort targeted at lion detection across the landscape. The confirmed records that exist come primarily from incidental sources: landowner trail cameras, road-killed specimens, and reports from hunters who encountered animals while pursuing deer or turkey. This is the monitoring baseline that exists for a state that may be in the early stages of apex predator recolonization. It is not adequate for the question being asked of it. A state that wanted to know whether a resident mountain lion population was establishing within its borders would need to do systematic monitoring, designed to detect low-density, cryptic predators across a large landscape, camera arrays placed in likely habitat with sufficient density and duration to detect rare individuals, genetic sampling from any available physical evidence to assess relatedness and sex ratios, and systematic track surveys in prime habitat during winter months when tracking conditions are best. Iowa has not committed to that monitoring investment, which means it is managing mountain lion presence with a fraction of the information it would need to make fully informed policy decisions. The comparison to Nebraska is instructive here as well. Nebraska DNR and the University of Nebraska have both invested more substantially in mountain lion monitoring than Iowa, in part because the geographic proximity of the Pine Ridge to the Black Hills source population and the documented breeding history in western Nebraska created more urgent management pressure. The Nebraska monitoring program has produced a much more detailed picture of mountain lion ecology in a Great Plains state than anything Iowa currently has, and that picture includes information about habitat use, movement patterns, and the kinds of areas within the Nebraska landscape that lions prefer for territory establishment. Several of the patterns identified in Nebraska are directly relevant to Iowa. Specifically, the strong association between mountain lion territory establishment and river corridor habitats with dense riparian woodland, high deer density, and low human disturbance. Iowa has multiple such areas, and several of them are in the eastern part of the state, far enough from the known Black Hills dispersal source that the DNR animal that was confirmed in eastern Iowa represents, if it was typical of what is moving through, more than just a quick transit across the state. The public awareness gap is one of the most practically significant issues in the Iowa mountain lion situation, and it deserves direct attention rather than treatment as a secondary concern subordinate to population status questions. The gap has two dimensions that operate somewhat independently. The first is rural and agricultural. Farmers, ranchers, and rural residents in areas of confirmed mountain lion activity are operating without standardized, accessible information about livestock protection practices, livestock guardian programs, reporting protocols, or the behavioral characteristics of mountain lion predation that would help them distinguish mountain lion kills from other predator damage. The Iowa DNR provides some of this information on request, but it is not proactively pushed to the communities most likely to need it. In established range states, livestock protection guidance for mountain lion territory is standard, well-publicized, and accompanied by cost-sharing programs for protective infrastructure. Iowa has none of that, because it has no official management program for a species it does not officially recognize as resident. The second dimension of the public awareness gap is recreational and suburban. Trail users in the Iowa River corridor systems that are also mountain lion movement routes, primarily the systems near the Missouri, Des Moines, Iowa, and Cedar Rivers, are moving through habitat that confirmed records indicate has been used by mountain lions with some regularity, without any site-specific signage, without trailhead information about mountain lion presence, and without the behavioral guidance that trail users in Colorado or California receive as a matter of course at every major trailhead. The argument that the confirmed occurrence rate does not yet justify the cost and public concern of standardized mountain lion signage at Iowa trail systems is a defensible management position. It is less defensible as the confirmed occurrence rate continues to increase and as the geographic range of those occurrences continues to expand eastward across the state. At some point, the argument that the risk is too small to warrant communication becomes a bet that nothing will happen before the communication infrastructure is in place. Bet wrong on that, and you are explaining to a family why they were not informed about something the wildlife agency knew about. The situation in neighboring states creates additional context that matters for Iowa's planning horizon. South Dakota, the source state, has an active mountain lion hunting season and a management program oriented around controlling Black Hills population growth within a defined range. The hunting pressure in the Black Hills has not prevented the range expansion that is producing dispersers into Iowa and other states, but it has been calibrated to manage population density and, to some degree, to regulate the rate of dispersal pressure. A state-level political change in South Dakota's approach to mountain lion management, whether toward increased harvest or toward greater protection, would have direct downstream effects on the rate of mountain lion dispersal into Iowa. The state of the source population matters enormously for what Iowa will experience, and it is controlled by decisions made in Pierre rather than Des Moines. Nebraska has an experimental mountain lion hunting season in the Pine Ridge that is adjusted annually based on monitoring data and is managed with the explicit goal of maintaining the population within a range that is compatible with the surrounding landscape. The Nebraska approach represents a more active engagement with resident mountain lion management than Iowa has been forced to develop, and the management expertise and policy frameworks Nebraska has built over years of managing a recognized resident population would be useful models for Iowa if its status changes. Minnesota and Wisconsin add another dimension to the upper Midwest mountain lion picture that gets less attention than it deserves. Because both states have confirmed mountain lion records, and because the geographic relationship between those states and Iowa suggests that the dispersal dynamic is broader and more multidirectional than the simple Black Hills to Iowa vector that dominates most discussion. Wisconsin has confirmed mountain lion occurrences going back to the early 2000s, several of them involving GPS-tracked individuals whose movement data was available, which provided detailed information about how lions navigate the upper Midwest landscape. Minnesota has a robust occurrence record, again, primarily, but not exclusively male animals, with some records from the northeastern part of the state that may involve individuals originating from different source populations than the Black Hills, possibly from the small but persistent population of mountain lions that biologists believe persists in the Ontario boreal zone, though that population's status is poorly documented and its contribution to Midwest dispersal is uncertain. What the Minnesota and Wisconsin records add to the Iowa picture is a sense that mountain lion movement in the upper Midwest is not a single one-directional flow from the Black Hills, but a more complex pattern of dispersal from multiple sources moving through a connected but fragmented landscape, and that Iowa sits in a geographic position that puts it in the dispersal shadow of multiple potential sources rather than one. The long-term implications of mountain lion recolonization for Iowa's deer population and the deer management industry built around it are another dimension of the conversation that is largely absent from current public discussion. Iowa deer hunting is economically and culturally significant in ways that are difficult to overstate. The annual deer harvest in Iowa runs to several 100,000 animals. The economic value of deer hunting to Iowa's rural economy, in license fees, guide services, lodging, food, and equipment, is in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Iowa has produced some of the largest white-tailed deer on record. The state's big buck culture is genuinely deep. Mountain lions eat deer. A resident mountain lion population in Iowa, if it established at the densities documented in successful recolonization cases in other states, would not crash the deer population. Mountain lions do not function as population regulators of white-tailed deer in agricultural landscapes the way they do in western landscapes, where prey diversity is lower and deer are more energetically important to the predator. But they would be a visible and economically noticed factor in the deer population, and the response of Iowa's hunting community to that factor would shape the political environment for mountain lion management in ways that wildlife managers need to be thinking about now, before the situation requires emergency policy responses. The experience of states that managed the transition from no mountain lions to resident mountain lions under the pressure of a politically mobilized hunting constituency that felt surprised and unrepresented in the decision-making process is not uniformly positive. The conservation framing of mountain lion recolonization in Iowa is worth being honest about as well, because the conversation about what this process means contains values questions that purely biological analysis cannot answer. There are people in Iowa and across the upper Midwest who would welcome the return of mountain lions to the landscape as an ecological restoration, as a sign of landscape health, as a marker of the kind of wildness that has been absent from the agricultural heartland for more than a century. There are others who would view it as an unwelcome complication to a landscape that has been shaped around human agricultural and recreational uses, and that does not have the institutional or cultural infrastructure to absorb a large predator without significant disruption. Both responses are coherent, and both deserve to be part of the conversation. The mountain lion did not disappear from Iowa because the landscape stopped being able to support it in a purely biological sense. It disappeared because humans decided, through the mechanisms of bounty systems and habitat alteration and prey depletion, that they did not want it there. Whether it returns, and under what conditions, will ultimately be shaped by the same force. Human decision-making about what kind of landscape Iowa wants to be. That decision is worth making consciously and with full information, rather than by default, which is what happens when wildlife managers wait for an established breeding population before engaging the public seriously on what is coming. The gap between what the science suggests about trajectory and what the public currently understands about mountain lion presence in Iowa is one of the more consequential information gaps in the state's current conservation landscape. Most Iowans are not aware that mountain lions have been confirmed in the state on multiple occasions. They are not aware that the confirmed detections span nearly every region of the state. They are not aware that neighboring states have documented confirmed breeding. They are not aware of what that biological trajectory implies about the probability of Iowa eventually joining the list of states with recognized resident populations. They are not aware because no one in a position of institutional authority has told them in a way that reached general public awareness. The Iowa DNR's communications about mountain lion occurrences have been factual, measured, and consistently framed around the episodic dispersal narrative that minimizes the sense of ecological change in progress. Those communications are not dishonest, but they are shaped by risk aversion about public reaction in ways that produce a population with less preparation than the situation warrants. The individual encounter advice for Iowa, as much as the state's low confirmed occurrence frequency makes it feel premature, is worth stating clearly, because the people most likely to need it are the ones least likely to be thinking about it. Mountain lion encounters in Iowa will almost certainly continue to occur. They will most likely continue to be with dispersing males, and most of them will not result in attack. But some of them will occur in circumstances, alone, in low light, on trail, with a dog, with a child, where the behavioral protocols used in established range states are directly relevant. Do not run. Make yourself large. Make loud, assertive noise. Do not crouch. Do not kneel. Do not turn your back. If the lion approaches, pick up children immediately. Do not approach the lion under any circumstances for any reason. If the lion attacks, fight back with everything available: hands, sticks, rocks, backpacks. Mountain lions in attack mode respond to vigorous resistance in ways that passive defensive positions do not. Every confirmed mountain lion fatality in the North American record involves either a victim who could not fight back, typically a child, or a victim who was alone when the attack completed. The people who have survived mountain lion attacks have almost universally done so by fighting back and by not being alone. These protocols are not complex. They are not intuitive for people who have never thought about them. They need to be taught, and they need to be taught before they are needed, rather than after. The monitoring question is ultimately where the most immediate practical action is possible. Iowa does not need to resolve the political and cultural questions about mountain lion management to invest in better monitoring. It does not need to pre-answer whether it would welcome or resist an established population to build the camera networks, genetic sampling protocols, and systematic track survey programs that would give it a clearer picture of what is actually happening in its landscape. Better monitoring is not a policy position. It is information, and the information it would produce is exactly what would allow Iowa to make the decisions that are coming about public communication, about livestock protection infrastructure, about hunting regulations, about corridor planning, about public education, with evidence rather than extrapolation. The cost of systematic mountain lion monitoring in a state the size of Iowa is not trivial, but it is not large relative to the cost of managing the public and political consequences of a confirmed resident breeding population that was not anticipated, not monitored, and not communicated about until it could no longer be avoided. The broader story that Iowa's mountain lion occurrences represent is ultimately a story about the edges of things. The edges of range, the edges of policy frameworks designed for one ecological reality encountering another, the edges of public knowledge about what is living in the landscape around them, the edge of a process that has been building in the Great Plains for 40 years and that is now close enough to Iowa's borders, and in some cases well inside them, that the question of when, not whether, becomes the more accurate framing. The 20-some confirmed detections in Iowa's DNR database are not a curiosity. They are not a string of one-off events that can be filed and forgotten. They are data points on a trend line that connects the Rocky Mountain recovery to a potential future in which the upper Midwest looks ecologically different than it has for 150 years. Whether that future produces human mountain lion coexistence that is well managed, well communicated, and as safe as it can reasonably be, or whether it produces the kind of surprised and underprepared public response that follows a predator's return when wildlife agencies have been cautious about acknowledging what the science was showing all along, depends on choices being made now. The mountain lion is not waiting for Iowa to finish the policy conversation. It is moving. It is crossing rivers and traversing cornfields and hunting deer in the bottomlands of the Missouri and Des Moines and Iowa rivers in the quiet between seasons. It is moving east. It has been moving east for a generation, and Iowa, a state that officially has no mountain lions, is full of its tracks.